Tomb Raider The Angel of Darkness has a bit of a reputation, and by that I mean it's shit. No. This is the game that took the Tomb Raider series and flushed it down the toilet to let it swim amongst the turds. And thus began a series of videos I made many moons ago about Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness. They were made at a time when the abomination that was Channel Awesome was at its height, and so set the tone for a lot of internet-based critique, and by that I mean anger and snark. But a decade has passed, I'm older, hopefully a little wiser, and I've recently replayed the game. I don't have the raw hatred for it that I once did, and in many ways I can actually see how wonderful it could have been. So it seems the time has come to go back to this game and take another look at it.
I'm tracking 5 Obscura paintings for a client.
Handle it, Joanna.
Graphics are always the most obvious place to start with a game, and overall this game looks fantastic for its time. This was one of the first games I owned for the PlayStation 2, and the upgrade from Chronicles was mind-blowing. What stood out to me during my recent Let's Play was the little things: light shining off a wet rooftop, beams of light shining through windows, and the reflections on a shiny floor. The real standout was the Hall of Seasons, which is one of the few times this game truly feels like Tomb Raider. It's evident throughout this section that the developers put a lot of effort into it, especially in the Breath of Hades and Sanctuary of the Flame sublevels. The wind blowing, the heat shimmers, the platforms that weren't giant blocks, all highlight the massive step up from the PlayStation 1 era. Yes, there's the odd dodgy texture, Lara has cuboids for fingers, and the reflections on the waters can be so intense you can't tell if what you're looking at is a reflection or something under the water. But these odd little hiccups are tolerable because everything else looks so good. As for Lara, while I'm not keen on the emo makeover, there is no denying that she looks great. This was back at a time when people still talked about a character being made up of X amount of polygons, so I can tell you that in the PlayStation 1 era she was made up of about 600. By this point she was made up by about 8,000, an incredible upgrade that allowed for a lot more detail. Thankfully the shrunken shoulders of the last revelation are gone, so her body looks a bit more normal, well, by core design standards. The boobs are still massive. And now they jiggle! Yes, Core Design didn't have time to implement half the gameplay mechanics, but they made sure those jiggle physics were in place. I couldn't find any interviews where they talked specifically about why they designed Lara the way they did, so I can only assume it was done to appeal to male gamers. While there were a couple of women who contributed to the earlier games, most notably Heather Gibson and Vicky Arnold, in all the research I did on Angel of Darkness, I never saw a single woman. In the end credits there are 3 women listed as FMV producer, manual designer, and as a part of the QA team. It feels like the game was made by a bunch of lads and there weren't any women around to say, "Seriously guys, bouncing boobies?" Breasts tend not to move this way because most of us tend to wear a bra, and I'm going to assume Lara does too. Yes, there are times when a lady may choose to go braless. Visiting Von Croy is not one of them. While we're looking at graphics, we might as well tackle the subject of locations. It's something of a contentious issue as most of the locations in this game are actually urban environments. Adrian Smith said in several interviews that Core felt that simply putting Lara back into the tombs again would cause them to be massacred by the fans. There was meant to be a mix of real-world settings and magical elements. Now that in itself is not something new to Tomb Raider. Think about the Great Wall of China or the city of Vilcabamba. It's also something I really love fiction doing, taking a modern setting or historical event and putting a twist on them. Murty Schofield's documents detail a hidden war throughout history between the Lux Veritatis and the Cabal, and done well, this could have been a really interesting element to the game. But what we ended up with was Lara running around a Parisian ghetto for hours. I know those early levels are such easy targets, but my god are they lifeless. Yes, it makes sense within the context of the story that the streets are mostly empty, but the tombs of previous games were empty and had more character than this. We spend the first few hours of this game running around dirty streets and dirty storm drains and going into abandoned nightclubs to listen to the banging dance music of 2003. No, this is my review, we are not listening to that rubbish. Now, just because something is urban doesn't mean it can't look impressive or be evocative. The Louvre is lovely, both the external building and the interiors, with its brickwork, its pinky purple hues, and its shiny, shiny floors. I've never made it a secret that I'm not fond of the modern levels in Tomb Raider. I think Adrian Smith is wrong. If Core Design has given us an entire game of tombs and ancient locations, I'd be one of those people defending Angel of Darkness till I'm blue in the face. It's not that graphics make a game, but good locations can give you an evocative gaming experience, one that stays with you long after you've forgotten about the terrible controls. Does Angel of Darkness ever achieve this? Aside from the Louvre, is there anything French about the French section of the game? What about Prague? Is there anything Czech about it? Once we go into the Strahov, this game could be set literally anywhere in the world, and all you'd have to do is change the accent of the guards. I know the locations are important to the backstory, but almost none of that appears in the final version of the game. A real standout for this game is the sound. The voice acting for the principal characters is a particular highlight, and if you read any reviews of this game it will become apparent that a lot of praise was heaped on Janelle Elliott. Now, I'll admit that when it comes to the PlayStation 1 games, my favourite Lara is Judith Gibbons, but Janelle Elliott's voice is absolutely perfect for Angel of Darkness's angrier, sharper, more emotive Lara.
I'm going. Egypt, Werner. You walked away and left me. There was no pity then.
Eric Lauren as Curtis and Josh Ackland as Eckhart also bring a lot to their roles. I'll return to the story in a moment, but one thing that is clear is that a lot of it was hacked and slashed. Nevertheless, the actors all do their bit to give their characters more gravitas than might be expected from the versions of them that ended up in the game. The bit part characters I'm less certain of. While it's always nice to play a game that isn't populated with American accents, Core Design have never been terribly good at portraying non-British accents.
She don't look much like one of them. Maybe she's an eco-terrorist or something.
And they wear hot pants, huh?
And I do have to wonder how many of these actors were actually European.
Hey, vous, plus un geste!
The music is outstanding and one of my favourite things about this game. Peter Connolly had already done some wonderful stuff with The Last Revelation, but here, teamed up with the London Symphony Orchestra, he created a score that was unlike anything I had heard in a game up until this point. The main theme beautifully ties in themes and motifs found throughout previous games, but still has its own identity. Either because of the game's problematic development or being a product of its time, there isn't a lot of nuance to the in-game music, so you often end up with dramatic pieces playing while not an awful lot is actually happening on the screen. While there's nothing wrong with the music of Angel of Darkness on a creative level, it does tend to just play on loop in the background of every level. The Storm Drains is a particular example of this problem. There's nothing wrong with the music exactly, it just goes on and on and on when this would have been enough. What always set Tomb Raider apart from other games for me was the quiet and the ambience, punctuated with occasional musical stings or longer mood-setting pieces. An earlier draft of this script had me stating that Angel of Darkness didn't live up to the standards set by previous games when it came to sound effects. But I decided for practical reasons to turn the music off when recording the footage for these videos, and it was the first time I'd ever done it with this game, and what a difference it made. I feel like such a dick saying this because, again, the music in this game is really good, but stripping it away and making certain sections just be about the ambience gave it more life than it had with the same piece of music playing on loop. Despite these issues, I'm still putting the audio in the good section because all of the constituent parts are really good, but like so many things in this game, it feels like the audio people never got the chance to finish it off and give it the polish that would have allowed for more subtlety in its execution. One of the reasons that this game has the fans that it does is the story. For all of my piss-taking over the years, you can't deny that the initial setup is riveting. Lara gets called to Paris by Von Croy, the meeting soon turns into an argument, and then Von Croy is murdered. Did Lara commit the murder? Well, no, of course she didn't, but still the setup is brilliant. If you watch or read any developer interviews for this game, you'll quickly notice that the buzzword was ambitious. The goal was to create a multi-game story told over a trilogy of Tomb Raider games, a Curtis spin-off, maybe even an Eckhart spin-off. The idea, as Adrian Smith put it, was to open up many doors but only close a few of them. Story elements would be brought up in this first game, but wouldn't even be overly clear until you had played the later ones. Smith says this as a positive, but actually it's a big problem for me, though I guess it depends on how you actually like an ongoing story to be told. Personally, I prefer self-contained stories that are part of a bigger whole. That way I get a satisfying conclusion at the end of part 1 or part 2. So I find the final section of the game, and specifically its ending, to be sloppy. Marty Schofield was clearly very passionate about the story and by all accounts could talk about it in great detail to anyone who asked. I'll return to the documents in a later video, but what is clear in them is how much effort went into the backstory and how much of it was inspired by real-world history and mythology. For example, the Lux Veritatis are portrayed as being an offshoot of the Knights Templar, and the idea of the Nephilim comes from Turkish mythology. But for all of that detail, there isn't a huge amount of it in the final game. Again, this could be due to how Core Design decided to tackle its storytelling over multiple games, but then it might be a symptom of a bigger problem Angel of Darkness has, a problem we'll refer to as the machete. Schofield has heavily implied that a lot of his story was cut or streamlined. In an episode of the Survivor Reborn podcast, he said that so much of Curtis had been stripped away that the final result more resembled a puppet than a character. One particular moment with Curtis that has always irked me is when he monologues about his father's death.
They're ancient weapons of the Lux Veritatis. 2 of them were entrusted to my father. Eckhart murdered him to stop them passing into my hands.
Who cares about a character who dies off screen just to give the on-screen character some motivation? It always irritated me, but it irritates me even more now because doing research for these videos, I know there is so much more to Curtis's father than just the casual fact he was killed by Eckhart. The Cabal is another obvious place in which things have been severely streamlined. The documents outline who these characters are, their own personal interests, what they add to the group. It also details the dynamics between them and how they are all jostling for power. In their first scene, none of them utter a single word. Boaz was fleshed out in quite a bit of detail in the documents, and yet we only get to hear from her in the moment before she is eaten by a giant plant. She dies in this game, so you can't even argue that we'll learn more about her in a future game. Angel of Darkness' story is one that had so much potential to be incredible and a real standout for its time. But compared to what it could have been, what it should have been, it feels so empty. And ultimately we can only judge a game's story by what is in the final product, not by the things the writer and developers wanted to put in there. There is another big problem with the story beyond the machete slicing and dicing it. Core Design were never very good at executing a story on screen. I think for the most part they got away with it in the PlayStation 1 era because back then there wasn't a huge emphasis on storytelling. It tended to be something at the beginning or end of a level as a way of tying them together. That's not to say the stories were bad, not at all, but go back and play the original game. Despite the awesomeness of the story, the number of cutscenes and FMVs is quite small by modern standards. By the time we get to the PlayStation 2 era, games are starting to become more narrative driven, and you would expect Core Design to up their game, but they really don't. Would it have killed them to learn what the 180-degree rule is? For those of you who don't know, imagine two people facing each other while talking, as is so often the case in this game. Now imagine a circle around them and a line down the middle. Within the 180 degrees of the half circle is where you place your cameras. The reason for this is that when you are framing your shots, one person will always occupy the left side of the screen, the other will always occupy the right. Yes, I'm about to tell you that Angel of Darkness breaks the 180 degree rule a lot. But there is a further complication. In dialogue scenes, there seems to be multiple camera angles for each line of dialogue, which are chosen at random.
An evil night to be out alone, Miss Croft. Our streets are not safe anymore.
Mademoiselle Carvier, I have just come from Werner's apartment.
And how is Werner?
I'm afraid Werner is dead.
Dead?
So we can end up with scenes like this. The first shot establishes Carvier on the left looking towards Lara, who is on the right, but the very next shot places Lara on the left looking to the right. Instead of creating the impression that they are two people looking at each other, it feels more like they are standing next to one another talking to an unseen third person in the room. Ultimately, what this ends up doing is highlighting the hideously patchy editing as we move from one block of dialogue to another.
I'm not going to waste any more time here. Do you have the notebook?
In action scenes, breaking the 180 degree rule can make the action look wrong, even when it's not. In this shot, we see Curtis on the left side of the screen looking towards the right. After Lara has turned to face him, the camera switches to the other side of the imaginary circle, so Curtis is now on the right side of the screen looking to the left. This is jarring enough, but his right hand was closest to the camera and is now furthest from the camera, creating the illusion that the gun has switched hands when it actually hasn't. There is also a lot of bonkers camera angles in this game, and this scene has my favourite. I mean, why? It's not like this is a live broadcast and they've accidentally ended up with a weird shot. Someone made the creative choice to place a camera at a low angle, looking up at their crotches. Is it meant to symbolise their throbbing desire for one another? Another thing that drives me nuts is the excessive amount of shots even when low action stuff is happening. That was done in 4 shots, one from above, the aforementioned crotch shot, another one from above, and then finally back to a close-up. 4 shots for such a simple movement. Could they not have just had the action happen within the same shot and thus avoid breaking the 180-degree rule? In the chase sequence that follows, the editing is frantic as hell. This kind of rapid editing has been in vogue for a while now in cinema, so someone somewhere must like it. Personally, I don't like shots that fly by so fast that before I've registered what's in them, we've already moved on to the next one. There are other things that annoy me. The framing of shots is terrible. How many times did they cut off someone's face? Or what about Lara noticing and picking up the Periap shard? You can hardly see it in the shot where she actually picks it up. The introduction of characters is often underwhelming, such as Eckhard, the black alchemist from the 12th century, who's a bit rude. And I've never understood why, when playing as Lara, this cutscene positions us with Curtis. You don't tell a story from a specific person's point of view, then have a scene that positions the audience with someone else. And then there's this moment. It's entirely possible that the script simply says Curtis disarms Lara, but good God, what were they thinking when they did this? I can't actually answer that with complete certainty because I've never found an interview in which developers talk about this moment, but I can take a guess. They thought this was sexy. Now, fans of the core design era love to argue that it was not core themselves that ever sexualized Lara. It was Eidos that did that with the marketing, and it was the media with the way they spoke about Lara.
There are 2 main reasons why people really get into Tomb Raider, and they're both on the front of Lara Croft. But it's the character of Lara that really makes the game, the character and the physical attributes.
But I would like to point out that it was Core who put this guy between Lara's legs. It was Core who made images like this. It was Core who teased us in multiple games that Lara was about to take her clothes off. And it was Core who introduced jiggle physics into the franchise. They thought this was sexy. The way the camera moves across Lara's body, lingering on her boobs and crotch, the way Curtis's hands run down her torso, that heartbeat sound, they thought this was sexy. This is not sexy. He is holding her at gunpoint. She is completely helpless. This is every woman's worst nightmare, that she is so powerless she can't stop bad things from happening to her. Lara has a look on her face that has always said to me she thinks she's about to be raped. This might be another example of what happens when there's no women around to suggest something might be a bit problematic. I know these things are easier to notice in the post-Me Too era, where we talk more openly about the bad things that happen to people at the hands of the powerful. But even at the time this game came out, I was grossed out by this, and it turned me against Curtis before I really got to know him. And while we're on the subject of story, we need to talk about Lara. I don't like her in this game. Various people at Core Design talked about how her experiences at the end of The Last Revelation had an enormous impact on her, and how that was a good way of giving the character a bit of a shake-up. It seems she's been shaken up into a person who is rude, bitchy, and at times downright nasty. In the past she's been snarky and rude, but that was exclusively aimed at the bad guys. In Angel of Darkness she is just rude to everyone. Everyone. Now, when she tells Eckhart,
Do you know, it's going to be a real pleasure to shut you up.
that's fine. Because he's killed a lot of people at this point, there is a sense that he's about to get what's coming to him. What has Janice done to deserve this?
I wouldn't worry. We're not in the same class.
What's the homeless guy done to deserve a posh rich woman teasing him with a monetary reward she doesn't have? And what has Luddick done to deserve this?
You unsavoury little runt.
Marty Schofield has heavily implied that runt is a stand-in for another word. That's who Lara is in this game, someone who descends to such crassness when she's mildly annoyed. I guess finishing school was a waste of her parents' money. So why is she behaving like this? I have headcanoned an answer to that question. Post-traumatic stress disorder. We know it increases anger and aggression. Lara Croft may be tough as nails, but it doesn't matter how strong you are. Going through a near-death experience will leave a mark. That being said, we didn't really talk about PTSD back in the early 2000s. It was another decade before we started to acknowledge the effects that Afghanistan and Iraq were having on our soldiers, so I don't think that's what the developers intended. Maybe it's another example of Core Design's approach to multi-game storytelling, setting stuff up and never giving us a satisfying conclusion. It's often irked me that Lara gets angry with Von Croy and says,
Egypt, Werner. You walked away and left me.
An unused cutscene for the game recreated the end of The Last Revelation and showed us explicitly that Von Croy tried his best to help her. Maybe the long-term plan was for Lara to realise that anger was clouding her thinking and that she would come to feel differently. We'll never know for sure, but what I do know is that after this game, Crystal Dynamics' warmer take on Lara was a blessed relief.
Isn't she beautiful? I'm falling in love all over again.
So as you can see, it's hard to talk about the good parts of this game without then talking about the bad parts that come along with it. So hold on to your hats for part 2 when we look at the bad of Angel of Darkness.